No. Yeah.
All right, I think that'll do.
Okay.
Who you are in the context of why we're gathered here today.
Well, I was a software engineer in ARC, that's the Augmentation Research Center, Doug's group, at SRI from 1969 to 1980, and then remained fairly close to Doug basically for the rest of his life. I met Doug, I had been a graduate student in physics at the University of Chicago in 1968, and the world blew up in 1968, and I left Chicago, came back out to California, wasn't sure what I was going to do. And my parents were living up here, and I was hanging out at my parents' house, and my dad had a visitor, and this visitor was a friend of his from World War II he hadn't seen since the end of World War II. This is, again, 1969. And my dad slipped him my resume, and he said, "Have you thought about computers?" And I said, "Well, yes, I've used them in physics." No, as ends in themselves. And it turned out he was a contract monitor for ARPA. And he was in town to visit the projects he supported at Stanford Research Institute, and also to go to a conference of the American Society for Information Scientists, which was up at the Hilton Hotel in San Francisco. And this was a year after the first major demo that Doug did in 1968, but they repeated it up at the Hilton in 1969. And my dad's friend said, "You meet me in the city, I want you to see this." So I went up and I saw basically the repeat of the famous demo. And then the next day, he had me go over to SRI in Menlo Park, and I spent quite a bit of time with Charlie Rosen, who was the head of the AI group, met Shaky the robot, learned about where artificial intelligence was going. And then they took me around the corner into Doug's group, and I met Bill English and Charles Irby and Doug and a lot of other people, and we all hit it off. But they said, "But you really don't know enough about computers." I said, "Well, what if I learn it?" "Well, give us a call when you do." And about that time, my parents were moving down to San Diego. I drove a car down and went over to UCSD and dropped in on a new department called Applied Physics and Information Sciences. The chair of the department was Irwin Jacobs, who later went on to found Qualcomm. And I walked in and I talked to them about what I was interested in doing, showed them my resume and my experience at Chicago. And they said, "We'll give you an assistantship. It starts in September. You have to teach beginning computer science." So I stayed basically a week ahead of the students. And after 2 months, I called Bill English and I said, "Okay, I know a little about computing." And they gave me an internship, and I was there for 10 years, 11 years.
Did you work closely with Doug directly?
Absolutely. I think everybody did. And sometimes we had little struggles because, one of the first projects I worked on was with Bill Duvall. It was the NOS Journal. And it was an amazing project. But then Doug wanted me to do something called the deferred execution system. He wanted something that secretaries could use to punch out paper tapes that could be deferred and executed later. And I hated the idea because we were doing interactive computing. Nobody else was doing it. But I did DEX, as it was called, and bit my tongue the whole time. Of course, Doug was right. It was a way of getting the system out much further.
What was it like working with Doug? Was he easy to work with, or difficult, or demanding?
Well, Doug was both easy and difficult. I mean, he was, just a very warm person, but he had a very precise language that, a number of us tried to interpret that language for broader audiences, and we could never get it right for Doug.
His broader vision, he had trouble communicating his vision?
I think of Moses and Aaron. Moses goes up to Mount Sinai and he sees the future, but he can't communicate it to the Israelites. He needed Aaron to interpret it, and it was never right. That was difficult. I wrote an article with Doug for Byte magazine that actually turned out to be one of the, I think, best explications of Doug's vision. And he was very grateful for that, but it was difficult. There was a conference at what used to be called the Association for Computing Machinery, the professional organization for computing, ACM, had in, I think, the 80s, called the History of Personal Workstations. It was held at one of the hotels across from Stanford. And all the famous computer scientists who had a lot to do with the creation of interactive computing spoke. And Doug was the only person who talked about people and what people's role was in the evolution of computing technology. And it was always the co-evolution of the person and the computer, and the bootstrapping of the computer and the people.
So is it like the computers were not an end in themselves, but they were just a tool to benefit human beings?
Absolutely, but also remember he had this concept of bootstrapping. We would use the tools to build the tools, and we were constantly pulling the rug out from under ourselves by constantly evolving, and it was exciting and exhausting.
Do you have any specifically, happy or fond memories about Doug that you'd like to share that stand out in your memory?
Well, none particularly, and as soon as I stop talking to you, something will come to my mind, but I can't think of anything right now.
Anything else you'd like to share about Doug or your work with him?
Well, I really felt that Doug never appreciated how appreciated he was by, for instance, the people at Apple. He felt he was misunderstood, and the thing is, a lot of people did get it. And there were parts of the vision that didn't get out, but they could.
Was he frustrated by not being understood, or did he feel, well, this just comes with this kind of territory?
I think the former. I think he felt he was not understood. But yet, we'd come to him and show him what people had implemented and what people were doing, and he was always impressed, but there was always more.